First of all, it's wonderful to stand before all of you today, and thank you, excellencies, students, and professionals that came out to participate in this conference. Let there be light may be, in fact, one of the most inspiring quotes ever written. We are not just dependent on light, but life itself couldn't exist without it. Light's significance in science, architecture, art, and philosophy has been a subject of investigation and contemplation for centuries. Light's substance and elusive properties continue to baffle us. Light behaves as if intelligent, knowing that someone is watching it perform. Newton's prism revealed a colorful nature, and the later discoveries that light is both wave and particle. Consequently, light matters. This year's main theme, Light Matters, brings together two seemingly contradictory ideas: the lightness of illumination and the materiality of weight. Thus, light matters. It also symbolically highlights the significance of light in architecture. This interplay invites us to reflect on how architectural elements gain deeper meaning, shaping space and expressing cultural narratives. Architecture is not just a container for light, but a medium that interacts. It's magnificent. And form and materiality cannot be visually perceived or expressed bodily without the presence of light. The absence of light, or lightness, according to ideas from Kant by Lobel, is a condition of darkness, formless and void, perhaps a moment before the expansion of time and space. Light, an electromagnetic wave, and a photon triggers chemical reactions so that we can see. Birkitz, dubbed the master of light, used light apertures and the illumination they produced for practical and symbolic purposes in his architecture. Citing Martin Schwartz, who's with us here today, very pleased that he could come and join us, Birkitz used light to direct views, indicate movement, highlight edges, fill spaces, and bring attention to ritual, working together to support a highly metaphorical architecture. In this image here, we see what happened at the beginning of creation. Volume 0 refers to Kelvin's definition of when all motion stops and gases freeze into a solid state, when the vibration motion of particles cease at absolute zero. Volume 0 also defines an immensely dense movement before the spatial expansion of the universe. Scientists describe this black, dense physical state as void of space and light and gravity, complete density, as a condition before the Big Bang. The observed universe continues to expand at amazing speeds, even now, defying our understanding of space, time, and light. Louis Kahn, a master of form and light, defined also his own idea of Volume 0 as a search for beginnings and being, a pursuit foundational to the material and spiritual aspects of his architecture. For countless years, human beings have walked the earth following the light and created volumes from the primitive hut to modern classics as tributes to light. Birkitz, dubbed as the master of light, used light apertures and illumination they produced for practical and symbolic purposes in his architecture. Ex nihilo, out of nothing, out of this density that had not yet expanded. And the phrase, "let there be light," activated that activity from the diagram I showed you. We, in our cultures, have many ideas of mega-narratives or creation stories, and they all differ, but they also, many of them are interrelated. The word myth, by definition, a traditional story, especially one concerning with early history of people or explaining some natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. A myth is also like a well-known story, which was made up in the past to explain natural events to justify either religious beliefs or social customs. Creation stories and myths from various cultures often emphasize several key themes. For example, human desire to create, the mortal underpinnings of all creation, the pleasure in creating. Each culture has its own creation story. The Chinese, one line was drawn from an existing chaos, then a second line was drawn. And as these two lines separated the heavens from the earth, the Samaritans assumed that the pantheon of gods existed before creation, and the heavens and earth were once together before they were split. And this idea of splitting and separating continues a third time in the Genesis account. Division and separation is part of the creation story. God separated darkness from light, thus the first day. The definition of day, we know it as a 24-hour period, but day can also mean other things. A particular period in the past, or a duration of time of a certain era. For example, the saying, back in the day. Genesis described the creation of this first day. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So darkness and light need each other. So in 1989, the world was on the threshold of change at many levels. The awaited unexpected collapse of the Soviet Union dissolved, and the borders between East and West, the creation of HTML language virtually changed everything. It brought us into a digital age. It brought us into 3 dimensions. The essential that was necessary to launching the World Wide Web. The Baltic states came together, joining hand in hand, physically linking Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius, establishing an emotional and physical call for independence. The 90s received us with a collapse of governments, a new world order, a virtual digital milieu, a world far beyond what anyone could have imagined or predicted. This empowered the people to hope, and the ability to imagine gives vision for reality and is essential to facilitate progress and change. And this is the context in which Birgit imagined at this time what the new library should be and mean. Imagination is at the heart of all creativity. Whether architecture or art or music or literature, imagination works hand in hand with reality, and both need each other. Michael Ward, a literary critic analyzing the literature of C.S. Lewis, one of the United Kingdom's most brilliant 20th century writers, and Oxford professor of medieval mythology, most popularly known for his famous tale, The Chronicles of Narnia. It's also in film format. Ward discusses metaphor and explains that Lewis didn't turn to the use of fairy tales to retreat from his argument and his beliefs in the Christian faith, but to advance his apologetic, he recast his arguments through story and poetics. Pure apologetic arguments come and they go and disappear and are time-bound, but stories essential to communicating an idea and captivating an audience. Just like these creation stories, they stay with us, they don't go. A metaphor is also very significant, and I just wanted to define what that is, because we're going to be hearing that word a lot today, particularly in our next few lectures. A figure of speech in which a word or phrase literally denoting one kind of object or idea used in place of another to suggest a likeness or analogy between them. According to Ward, poets are the acknowledged legislators of every age. When you turn something into symbols and story and characters, you captivate an audience for all time. To bring change, you must start with the people engaging the culture. The collapse of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe was first initiated by intelligentsia, by the poets and the musicians. The politicians arrived later, but poets like Iman Ziedons, architect Gunnar Asseris, or musician Ieva Akuratar kindled the awakening in Latvia through the media of culture. Gunnar Birkit's proposed library design was not just a pragmatic solution, but an architecture that symbolized the times of building that community and that communicated a story. The Latvian National Library became a metaphor of freedom and independence. Birkits used the metaphor and literally myth to cast his arguments through the language of architecture, which captivated yearning nations, their hope and desires for independence. Gunnar defined an architect as someone that designs and actually builds and does not just talk about it. Clearly, not all that study architecture become architects. Birkit says, I'm not an architectural journalist, I'm not a historian or critic or theorist. Gunnar explained that like Brahms, who composed music, he composes architecture. He did not develop a theory or dogma and then build a building. He came up with a concept and developed it organically, synthesizing the project's components, investigating the site, attentive to the natural daylight and the program, looking for the particular aspects of each project. Gunnar Birkit's renowned modernist architect and artist used a synthetic approach to design. Gunnar tells he was an extension of the modernist era and grew up while the modernists were still alive. The masters such as Corbu, Wright, and Mies van der Rohe were all practicing at that time. They were still alive. And Gunnar had synthesized these modernist ideas and teaching in his own way, but never held to any specific dogma or allegiance. However, Gunnar admittedly was greatly influenced by Alvar Aalto, a Nordic master. Gunnar strongly believed that architecture starts where words veer off. He did not theorize projects. He left that to others. Even though Gunnar was not following specific theories or dogmas, he was not opposed to the verbalizers of theories, those that are interested in promoting a certain direction or dogma or focused only on one particular facet of architecture. These are the ones that only talk about architecture. While admittedly, they did in some way supplement and provide impulses, curiously or not, or consciously or not, he incorporated his own ideas and inputs into his own synthetic process. Birkits believed that architecture starts where words leave off. The Latvian National Library brings a soft, diffused northern light into the central atrium that gently illuminates the balconies below, creating a very peaceful and tranquil environment within the building. Birkits also used light for its symbolic and metaphorical significance, communicating spiritual meaning. This physical and phenomenological effect of light differs from light's symbolic meaning, the power being a nation's spiritual awakening. Birkits was always conscious of light as a material design element, which directly impacts his architecture. Light is a particle of color as well as a wave of energy. A little bit about folklore and DNA. The Latvian National Library was based on an evolving metaphor. It continued to change over a long period, and as I said before, these multiple metaphors is what gave the project strength. Gunnar first imagined the library as a glass mountain, symbolizing Latvia's captivity, based on the mythological story, symbolizing a nation rising from its slumber, this serving as a metaphor for freedom and liberty from its oppressors. First a crystal mountain, and later a castle of light, as multiple metaphors were put upon this object. Gunnar used multiple metaphors in development of his library design. To emphasize again the use of metaphor and symbolism, was in his DNA. The use of metaphor is the bridge between literature and architecture. Michael Ward, who was critiquing Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, in discussing how metaphors work in literature, he argues that metaphors have boundaries. So you need multiple metaphors to talk about the very same thing, so you can look at it from different angles. The use of multiple metaphors gives the story additional insights and understanding. Multiple metaphors allow the author to build a story with deep character. The National Library Project successfully encapsulates multiple metaphors with rich meaning and perspectives, and this is what allowed it to sustain this long period of development. Clearly, these multiple metaphors gave power and allowed his vision to survive Latvia's political resistance to the project, the turbulent economy, social change, and of course, advancing technologies. Beyond supersensible, sensibility is what we don't necessarily consciously feel, but we feel in our subconscious. Gunnar imagined a building that captured what was already felt, anticipated, and expected in the people. Ward explains in literature, when one goes beyond the supersensible, you have to switch to metaphor. C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles wants the reader to feel the spiritual symbols, the elements and characters of the story, rather than first identify them with our minds. It's sort of like similarly walking along a winding medieval street, like in our old town, in great expectation of what is around the corner. He wants to arouse the affect, the senses first, to go beyond the surface and touch those inner feelings. To do that, we have to capture the reader's attention. Through metaphor, identifying the literary mechanism does not spoil the story, but makes one aware to appreciate while reading the story that deeper patterns, layers, and spiritual significance. Gunnar says, I am always trying to speak meaning in architecture and to seek for concepts and then work with those concepts. Gunnar's library is a synthesis of these multiple inputs and layers, signs, symbols, stories, as well as pragmatic and functional requirements, spatial effects, and the orchestrated play of light. Additional layers of information, technology, and communication requirements were synthesized into the design building. The original library design was based on Soviet norms, but then it was also redesigned during that process based on European standards. And so the multiple layers of information, program changes, and functional ideas also impacted the final design. But Gunnar's concept for the building never changed. While the project did evolve as a synthesis of developing requirements and inputs, therefore the various layers of meaning and symbolism could accommodate the changes. The process Gunnar referred to as organic synthesis, of bringing together all the input guided by one evolving concept. Just a bit on creativity, just a few comments, which I found very interesting in an article in discussion with Gunnar. On creativity, everything depends on our response, our interaction, and our correction. The brain needs to be triggered by the hand as much as the hand by the brain. So he was very concerned and used sketching as a design instrument during all of his processes. You draw two lines, he says. The eye feeds that information to your brain. The brain tells you, draw another line. And the process starts, this interaction between our thoughts and what we put on paper. Birgit's design methodology was a synthetic process, always looking for the particular of each project. Gunnar did not create a building from a predetermined form and then fill it with a program. He worked a process that amalgamated all the building components that resulted in a form generated and structured by an underlying concept. Gunnar did not claim to be a theorist, or to be guided by dogmas and ideas. They were made operable through a powerful concept that held everything together. Christian Gears from the architecture firm called Office, in a collection of essays without content, cites Saul Levitt, modernist artist who entertains the following point. I believe the appearance of a work is secondary to an idea of a work, which makes the idea of primary importance. The conceptual idea was essential to creating architecture form and perhaps more important than the actual result. Well, Gunnars didn't believe that. Birkitz held an opposite approach to Levitt, at least within the context of architecture. An objective architecture, for him, the primary goal is the actual built result. Undeniably, Gunnar's particular process delivers an architectonic intention that emanates architectural presence and meaning because of its indisputable literary content. In other words, an architecture that projects and speaks meaning. It's not words or theoretical discourse about an idea, but primarily the architectural result that speaks meaning. In an article from Reflections, Volume 1, from fall 1983, quite a while ago, Birkitz was interviewed and they asked him, do you have a theory of your own that you follow? And Birkitz answered, each solution is based on a theory that develops in the process. So what do you, or when do you state what this theory is? At best, not at all, since at the time of conception, it is consciously not there. And then they ask him again, then, when do you apply the theory to your process? Well, consciously, never. When the building has been built, the theory is intrinsically visible. It is guided by the process. So the ideas and the theories that the buildings are about are in the physical built form, was his focus. Gunnars also looked at design in two approaches. He saw it as a biotechnical versus a conceptual approach. Birkitz believed that there are two kinds of architecture, the biotechnical or the conceptual, which is the purest form evolved from the subconscious. I have a belief that there can be poetry in high technology. That's a very interesting statement. I want to use high technology to express other qualities other than the modular, the pragmatic results from application of factored parts. Gunnar believed it's not words, but architecture that speak meaning. Gunnar took issue with paper architecture, which he criticized as conceptual dead ends or theoretical projects. Gunnar didn't succumb to particular theories, schools of thought, or support the proliferation of a specific dogma, even though he's considered a modernist. He looked critically at academic institutions that just focused on theories. As old as Vitruvius, architecture is not achieved if it lingers only in the shadow of words and theories. Conceptual must deal with all of the pragmatic issues of a building, but is based on an idea, a vision. It is expressed and carries meaning. It communicates it in part something higher, an aesthetic satisfaction that we usually associate with art and music. This type of architecture has a different base or origin than the other, the conceptual versus the biotechnical. It is conceived artistically and is used, and it uses the so-called tools of the artist. Birkitz was concerned about form, texture, color, metaphor, symbolism, and light. Conceptual architecture makes the concept visible. Architecture is an art form. In the previous slide, I showed you the frame of this building, but when we look at this building, we clearly see the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis, Minnesota, constructed from 1976 to 1980. Architecture is an art form. The architect is basically a doer and an artist. An architect has certainly be an artist, but not all are artists. And as you see in the previous slide, he's not ignoring the technical requirements. And the idea of this building is quite clear: suspended bridge bank between these two pilasters. But it's a piece of art. That was his goal. Gunnar Birkitz explained during the 1980 Sci-Arc lecture in Los Angeles, Objective Architecture lecture, that if an architect is an artist, he works with the tools of an artist. Architecture is an art form, so he works with form, texture, color. He works with metaphor and symbols. The architect either designs symbols into his architecture, or he creates buildings as symbols and works with creative vision to achieve that. I come from the north, Birkitz says, where light is not very plentiful, and so I have an intuitive feel about light. I know how to take it in, reflect it, and deflect it. Here's a plan image of the Lincoln Elementary School project in Columbus, Indiana, from 1965. Birkitz was his master of light principles were reflect, deflect, direct, and light also had its symbolic value. He also was concerned about the building envelope as an outside shell, the building envelope as an interior shell. Gunnar is known as the master of light and for his ability to stage light within his buildings. His buildings were not built as containers to hold light, but to direct it, manipulate it, and reflect it. His architecture is a synthesis of various inputs and architectural response to the purpose and function of light. In one sense, his architecture surrenders to serve light's purpose. The architectural solution serves the purpose of light, and it is subordinate to light. It makes light operable within the interior spaces of the building. As you see here in this section, the skylight isn't horizontal, but it's vertical, because he was very concerned about how that light comes in and gets reflected. Gunnarsson describing in one of the churches designed by Alvar Aalto, Birkitz described the modernist Alvar Aalto's Vokasaniska church as a building with two shells, the exterior one with protective glass and mainstay, and the interior one of glass and plaster and surfaces. Birkitz brings attention to the interstitial space, the space that's in between the outside shell and the inside shell. He uses that as a diaphragm to bring light into the building. The exterior is to enclose, protect, and transmit light. The interior shell is to correct acoustics, form space, and enclose light to redirect, deflect, and transmit and celebrate light. And here you see one of his studies. He spent more time in section, I think, than he did in plan, because he was concerned about how light is going to come into that space. University of Michigan, the Allen and Lean Law Library edition in 1981. The university, I visited this building myself many years ago, and it was literally a phenomenal experience standing at the bottom of this building, almost 4 floors below, looking up at the building that he actually paid wonderful respect to. His building basically was invisible, and the building that was there was celebrated. And here are some images of this trough that he carved into the earth to bring light down into the lower levels of the library addition that also reflected that light into those spaces. This is a study model of that project. And how he brought light in and the view up from the lower floors to the actual original campus buildings built in this neo-Gothic style. And I also can advise everyone to take a look at the exhibit. This building is also featured on the exhibit here on the first floor. Also want to thank the students involved with building these models. Had a wonderful support, and their addition to the exhibit is much appreciated, and please take a look at this exhibit while you are here during this conference. Then 2 more slides. Afterwards, architecture starts where words leave off. Gunnar believed it's not words, but architecture that speak meaning. Gunnar took issue with the paper architects, as I said before. Gunnar didn't succumb to particular theories. Gunnar's believed, as old as Vitruvius, architecture is not achieved if it lingers in the shadow of words and theories. Vitruvius clearly said there's architectural theory and there's practice, but you cannot live just in one. Gunnar believed that built architecture speaks meaning most powerfully through its physical form. While this was true, his projects were driven by strong concepts and incorporating metaphors and symbolism. Regarding transparency, just one closing comment here. Gunnar said a very interesting thing here about language. The form of the Latvian National Library is unique and does not align with any standard or recognizable type which we identify as a library. What should a library look like then? How does the language of architecture communicate that? How does language of architecture work? Gunnar said, if you know the whole alphabet, you can say something with the right combinations. Gunnar, at the library grand opening speech, referred to the Latvian National Library as a temple that contained books, manuscripts, and words. We can say the nation's treasures are stored in the temple's Holy of Holies, in the archives, literally and metaphorically, lifted above the river Daugava, protected from danger and floods. The library is a modern-day temple that stores and protects our nation's heritage, its literature, its story, and ideas fixed in written form. So, the next architecture. This is, in one ways you could say, I'm closing with this, but this is also a wish that Birgits made in 1985 as he spoke at Columbia University. He said, people's real lives are not only made of their present condition, but their ambitions and dreams. Today's challenges and constraints are distinct. Birgit saw the next architecture as compassionate toward the human race, to seek to accommodate, please, and inspire. It recognizes the past achievements in our civilization which are applicable and can be accommodated. Birgit distinguishes himself from those overly pragmatic directions in architecture which only permit talk about particularities, about technical issues, about facts given by conditions and constraints from the site. Where design only deals with these constraints, he saw as problematic. In other words, a building is more than solving the pragmatic problems, but must accommodate desire. People's real lives are not only made of their present conditions, but their ambitions and dreams. I try not to forget the beauty in a time of change, economic pressure, ecological or energy concerns. For me, architecture is and will always be an art form. So in closing, Birgit looked at civilization's past achievements, he synthesized present needs, and wrapped our future desires in light. Thank you.